Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Next, to the latest in our New Line series, which examines life in Britain in 2019. Today, we're looking at the issue of debt for low-income families. The lack of affordable housing combined with high interest loans, often from illegal loan sharks, means many people on low incomes are struggling to survive in modern Britain. Sally Lockwood has this report.
I have actually contacted these and explained the situation.
Debt is an invisible burden being carried by the country's most vulnerable.
These have been the last of my worries.
As a single working mum, Michaela's maternity pay hasn't been processed by her employer, and it's pushed her from being OK to being in crisis with a newborn and an 11-year-old.
They can apologise all they want and they can say, we understand, but they don't understand. They will never understand what it's like because it'll never happen to them. What makes me feel more angry is that it's maternity. It's put in place to protect women.
Michaela is far from alone. Families falling into debt through no fault of their own. Research done for Sky News shows the poorest 10% of households with a debt spend a third, 34% of their gross income on repayments. That's more than 3 times the case for average household incomes. And 31% of people experiencing hardship use loans to finance day-to-day spending. That's bills, food, simply living. And among this demographic, 32% are already having difficulties keeping up with debt repayments. Again, these figures much higher than for those on average incomes. So where can people turn for help? One offer has come to Michaela in the form of a letter from loan company Provident. It sells the picture of a perfect Christmas, along with loans at 535%.
They said once I paid so much off, I could have another one.
Mary took out a £300 Provident loan last Christmas, then another. She doesn't want to be identified, so we've changed her name. What are the repayments?
About £55 a month.
Are you paying them?
No, I couldn't afford it. I couldn't afford it.
Debt isn't a deprivation issue, but affordable credit is. And doorstep loans and loan sharks are 2 of the main sources of cash for people experiencing poverty. Doorstep lenders like Provident are legal and provide credit that otherwise wouldn't exist for many people. But loan sharks are criminals and set their own terms. Here, the illegal money lending team are doorstepping a suspected loan shark in Leeds with an arrest warrant.
Open the door, please, it's a police! And this is what we see time and time again. They portray themselves as your best friend. Our average APR is about 15,000%, but we've seen it as high as 4.5 million%.
Deprivation offers little way out of debt. It's a losing battle, an endless cycle, and little comfort knowing so many families are in the same position. Sally Lockwood, Sky News, Birkenhead.
Well, joining me now is Laura Gardner from the Resolution Foundation, a think tank focused on improving the living standards for those on low to middle income families. Many thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon. The findings are alarming, if somewhat unsurprising, given the issues that people have had with universal credit. Just tell us a little bit more about what you found out.
So the findings are really stark, as you said. I think the package you just showed us brought that home, particularly in terms of the challenge that debt creates for those on the lowest incomes and the most vulnerable in society. Now, this, as many people will know, is a problem that built up going into the financial crisis. It's not the case that levels of credit for those on the lowest incomes have necessarily got any higher since the crisis. They still remain too high. But what's really characterised the last decade is the poor performance of people's incomes, and more recently, the transition to this new welfare system, universal credit, which has this rigidity and these gaps in terms of in payments, in terms of when you move on to it, that means that those carrying debt suddenly find themselves pushed over the edge. So the big concern here for those on the lowest incomes is they've been enduring all this debt over a period when their incomes haven't been growing and now their benefits are changing. And then you're left with the question of what to do when the fridge breaks.
What are your recommendations?
Well, this is tricky. So there has been policy action in recent years. For example, there's now a cap on the interest that you can charge on payday loans. And there is a case for going further in terms of restricting credit practices, but we don't want to go too far because that's just likely to push lending for those on the lowest incomes underground, and that's going to be even harder to regulate. So I think while we need to think about what more we can do in terms of keeping credit affordable for the most vulnerable in society, we also have to look at income growth and the provision of benefits, be that in universal credit or other benefits, because it's that lack of income and that lack of benefits that is really making it a challenge for people to keep up with their debt repayments and mean that small shocks can cause really big disruptions.
And there's also an issue of people going to money lenders. What they're doing is not illegal, but, you know, they would be accused of being unscrupulous. The money lenders, seeing figures of average APR being 15,000%. You know, it would be very different for you and I if we were to go out and try and get a loan.
That's absolutely right. I think the difference between lower and higher income households isn't necessarily the amount of credit they're taking out and how that's changed in recent years. It's two things. It's the cost of that credit, with lower income households typically having access to much higher cost credit. And even more fundamentally, perhaps, it's just how much other income they have to get by and to meet those repayments. So we've had policy action to put some caps on interest rates on some kinds of payday loans, and we could look at more things that could be done there. But if we really want to protect the most vulnerable in society, those on the lowest incomes, we need to also think about a welfare system that isn't designed to push people further into these kinds of problems, but rather stops them from happening in the first place.
I mean, today here on Sky News, we're also reporting about the rise in rough sleeping. I mean, to what extent should government be held to account? Because ultimately, it's not about how a government chooses to spend its money on its people.
Well, we've got lots of moving parts that have created the situation we're currently in terms of people's living standards and the way they're accessing credit. We know that the kind of underlying driver of stagnant incomes is poor productivity growth across the economy. But there are bits of policy where we might think about the additional burden they're creating. So we are having billions of pounds taken out of the welfare system over the current Parliament, even with some recent changes, for example, in universal credit. We've had things like council tax support localisation, which means many of the lowest income families in society are having to make small minimum council tax payments, and councils tend to be really quite aggressive in collecting that. So I think there's lots of different moving parts, lots of different actors, and we have to think about the overall economic context. But it's definitely the case that there's bits of the policy agenda in recent years that haven't particularly helped in terms of these tricky circumstances many low-income families find themselves in.
Yeah, the new Work and Pension Secretary, Amber Rudd, has recently announced new changes to the universal credit system. Are you hopeful that they will make a difference, that they will ease the load on people who have got living in very difficult circumstances?
So I think Amber Rudd's been highlighting all the right issues since she took over as Work and Pension Secretary, a real willingness to listen, a real drive to go back to the original intent of universal credit. The changes so far that she's made have been quite small, but I am hopeful that further changes can be made. There was lots of investment in terms of the generosity of universal credit in the budget last year, but what we need now is a really serious think about some of the problems when people move on to the benefit and some of the rigidity when they're claiming it. So things like the 5-week wait for the first payment, and just how tricky it is to claim for childcare costs and get your housing support at the right time. Universal credit needs to fit better with the reality of families' lives, not just work as a system for the bureaucrats, if it's going to achieve its objectives of making work pay. And I think Amber Rudd is listening, so we can be hopeful for a bit more action there.
Laura, really interesting talking to you. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks.